thank you for coming. So I especially want to welcome the many families that are here today who've been impacted by the awful crimes that are subject of the Kenova Final Report. This has been and continues to be a body of work that has changed my life, Sir Iain's, and everybody involved in Operation Kenova. And that's because the victims in this room represent courage, humility and dignity. And it's been a privilege to come to know you. I'll now invite Sir Iain Livingstone, the officer in overall command, to introduce his final report, after which I will make some remarks. Thank you.
Chief Constable Jon, thank you, and I will try my best to project to fill the room, as well as the media microphones that are here. Investigating and reviewing events from decades ago is extremely complex, where evidence is often lost, contaminated, or diminished over time. This applies in all jurisdictions and to all crimes. But to seek the truth and provide information to victims and families is harder still when the events under investigation occurred during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where opposing perspectives are common and where achieving the trust of all communities is critical. Kenova has shown that it can be done. It requires investigative drive and a complete commitment to victims and families. 9 years after being established, this final report captures the experience of Kenova and the issues that have arisen as we pursued evidence and answers. I have been the officer in overall command for the last 2 years, and it is a privilege to submit this final report. However, the greatest privilege that I have had has been the opportunity to meet and listen to victims and families from the Troubles, who consistently demonstrate dignity and grace in the face of appalling suffering from brutal terrorism, at times compounded by state failures to act legitimately or with empathy and care. Through Jon's leadership, Kenova has from the outset put the interests of victims and families at the heart of its approach. We learned that an outcome through the criminal justice process may in fact not always be achievable or even what is desired. Kenova detectives prioritise listening and being responsive to questions unanswered for decades. And this morning, as we have always done, we recognise the courage and commitment of the police officers, soldiers, and other members of the security forces who sought to uphold the rule of law in Northern Ireland during the tremendously challenging times of the Troubles. Kenova benefited from the personal experiences they shared with us to help an understanding of the pressures they were under and the environment in which they were operating. The undertaking given by Kenova to issue public reports wherever possible was innovative, informing fellow citizens of what was found, even where criminal prosecutions did not result. It added time and complexity around issues of national security and individual confidentiality, but it was another key element in building trust and confidence in victims and families and across wider society, of which the publication of this report this morning is a key part. Gathering intelligence is essential to prevent terrorism, to save life, and to investigate crime. The use of informants or agents has been and will remain an important source of such intelligence. In addition, the protection of those sources is vital for their safety and to ensure individuals in the future will provide intelligence to state authorities. The policy of NCND to neither confirm nor deny is well established and an important safeguard for those who provide intelligence. Having spent my life in policing, I support NCND and know its value. Although the policy's definition and use require review, in my opinion, Kenova has no intention to undermine NCND. However, NCND must be exercised in a proportionate and necessary manner and should not be an absolute bar to providing truth and justice. It cannot be used to protect agents who commit grotesque, serious crime, leaving victims and families ignored and their demands for information and answers dismissed. As this final report makes clear, we in Kenova believe there is a compelling ethical case for the UK government to derogate from the NCND policy regarding the agent Stakeknife's identity. It is in the public interest that Stakeknife is named. We may have completed this report far earlier had MI5 not discovered fresh material relating to Stakeknife in the spring of 2024. These revelations, which continued over a number of months during 2024, were extremely disappointing, given that the investigation into Stakeknife had been completed and decisions not to prosecute already taken by the Public Prosecution Service for Northern Ireland. The circumstances regarding the new MI5 material are set out fully in this final report. This morning, I would reiterate how shocked we were within Kenova to learn of this new material and how desperately disappointed we were to then explain to victims and families that we had not, in fact, received all relevant material, despite past assurances. The new material revealed that MI5 had greater and earlier knowledge of Stakeknife than we had previously been told. PSNI, the Public Prosecution Service, had a view that the material would not have altered prosecution decisions, although investigative opportunities were undoubtedly lost as a consequence of MI5's late disclosure of relevant material. But the very fact that material owned and held by MI5 was not timorously disclosed understandably undermined the confidence of communities that state authorities had cooperated fully with Kenova. The Director General of MI5 shared this concern, and he therefore committed resources to establish and disclose all the material it held. But notwithstanding the Director General recognising the issue, it was a significant failure on the part of MI5. Once Kenova had become established, it quickly and rightly built a reputation for integrity and investigative excellence. Accordingly, Kenova was subsequently tasked by the PSNI to conduct additional independent investigations and reviews beyond its initial commission regarding the conduct of the agent Stakeknife. These additional elements were made up of Operation Mizzenmast, the investigation into the murder of Jean Smith Campbell in 1972, Operation Turma, the murders of Sergeant Sean Quinn and Constables Paul Hamilton and Alan McCloy, and an explosion at Kinnigo Embankment in 1982, and Operation Denton, a review into the Glenanne series. Now, summaries of these three operations also form part of this final report. Operation Denton differed from the other Kenova operations in that it was a review rather than a criminal investigation. However, in addition to reviewing previous investigations and materials, the Denton review team also looked for and discovered new information on what had become known as the Glenanne series. These were vicious sectarian murders and attacks in the 1970s, carried out against members of the Catholic community in both Northern Ireland and Ireland, a number of which involved deplorable collusion with loyalist terrorists on the part of some serving police officers and members of the military. There is no doubt that collusion took place, much of it long established publicly before Denton was actually initiated. And our findings show that it manifested itself in various corrupt ways and beyond any identifiable distinct group. The extent of involvement in sectarian attacks by some members of the security forces was shocking, but we did not see any evidence that it occurred or was directed at a political or strategic level. Across the entirety of the Kenova work, the team has worked intensely to seek answers, provide explanations, and pursue justice. At times, some of our findings did not align with what victims and families expected, often due to false narratives and theories being developed, at times understandably due to a vacuum of information. However, our duty was to seek the truth relentlessly and then share as fully as we could with those who deserved to hear it and who had endured the traumatic attacks. Kenova has now completed its work. What about the future? I assess that Kenova greatly influenced the joint framework from the governments of Ireland and the United Kingdom issued in September earlier this year. Both governments had been told by victims and families and groups who support them that the approach, the ethos, and the experience of Kenova represented best practice. Investigations must be rigorous, independent, and have access to all information. Victims and families must be central to all policies and actions. There can be no immunity for those who committed murder and serious crime. A robust disclosure regime must exist, and oversight and governance must accompany investigations and information recovery. Victim focus groups and advisory boards can be established to assist legacy work. Now, of course, the manner in which both governments give effect to the framework will be paramount, and both have made commitments to provide funding and legislative time for implementation. They have also committed to share information across borders and to ensure their respective state agencies comply with requests for information. In the UK, the government has introduced the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill, which will repeal the 2023 Legacy Act and establish a reformed Legacy Commission and a joint independent commission for information retrieval. The Northern Ireland Troubles Bill does not reflect all elements of Kenova, and ensuring investigators have access to all information must be enabled through the bill. It will therefore be critical how the bill is amended and then implemented as it goes through Parliament, including whether sufficient resources and investigative powers are allocated to the reformed Legacy Commission. Notwithstanding my comments, in my view, this new legislation and the shared approach from the UK and Irish governments should be welcomed as a foundation for progress. It is right to build on the existing structures. As for many victims and families affected by the Troubles, time is of the essence. Addressing legacy matters from the Troubles in Northern Ireland in a fair and transparent manner is vital to acknowledge the suffering of families and provide answers for what happened in the past. But it is also a vital enabler for today, to ensure the continued legitimacy of policing and other state agencies now and in the future. Before I hand back to Chief Constable Boutcher, I think it appropriate to take us back to the start of Kenova, which began with a request to examine the activities of the alleged army agent codenamed Steakknife. Thus, for transparency and understanding, I will summarise what I see as key facts regarding Steakknife, which Kenova has established. Steakknife was recruited as an army agent in the late 1970s and operated as such for over a decade into the 1990s. Throughout this period of operation, Steakknife met his handlers on average once every 7 or 8 days. The RUC Special Branch and MI5 knew of Steakknife's recruitment and identity from the outset and were supplied with his intelligence throughout, including reports disclosing his involvement in the abduction and interrogation of suspected agents who were then murdered by the IRA. The further material disclosed by MI5 in 2025 covered almost the entirety of the period of Steakknife's operation. During an 18-month period at the start of his career as an agent, Stakeknife produced at least 377 intelligence reports and a total of 3,517 intelligence reports attributed to him were ultimately recovered by Kenova. Further, in the period between the conclusion of the Stevens inquiry in the early 2000s and the commencement of Operation Kenova in 2016, the MOD destroyed original documents relating to Stakeknife, including, for example, and importantly, 2 files of contact forms which recorded meetings with his handlers. At different points, both the RUC Special Branch and MI5 offered or sought to take over the running of Stakeknife from the Army. Following the recruitment of Stakeknife, the Army established a dedicated subunit known as the Rat Hole, specifically to deal with Stakeknife's handling and intelligence. MI5 had a member of staff permanently located within the Rat Hole. A bespoke database known as Bog Rat 3970 and Osborne was established to process Stakeknife's intelligence, but no trace of that database remains. A number of Stakeknife's Army handlers went on to work for MI5, including as Assistant Secretary Political and Deputy Assistant Secretary Political, supporting the Director and Coordinator of Intelligence, a role which was MI5's main representative in Northern Ireland and acted as a principal security advisor to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. MI5 was involved in tasking Stakeknife through his military handlers, and it received debriefs on all his intelligence and was involved in discussions about his role, importance and use. Furthermore, MI5 also supported his operation through the provision of specialist support. Stakeknife's Army handlers routinely massaged his ego, for example, telling him that if he stopped reporting, quotes, the loss would be felt throughout the intelligence world, close quotes. The Army also paid Stakeknife tens of thousands of pounds and helped him purchase a property. They discussed ways he could obscure the ownership of his assets so as to protect him against future potential legal claims. And they discussed the provision of a 5 or 6 figure sum to cover a pension or salary for Stakeknife. For a period towards the end of the 1980s, the Army temporarily stopped sharing Stakeknife's intelligence with the RUC because it suspected that the RUC has used it to identify someone suspected of murdering a police officer, and therefore this could have compromised Stakeknife's identity. Early attempts to resettle Stakeknife were unsuccessful, and he was eventually resettled in Great Britain in the mid-2000s in a detached property and a private motor vehicle. Stakeknife's Army handlers flew him out of Northern Ireland on military aircraft for holidays on 2 occasions when they knew that he was wanted by the RUC for conspiracy to murder and false imprisonment. Kenova prosecution files named Stakeknife as a suspect in connection with more than 24 offences, including allegations of conspiracy to murder, conspiracy to unlawfully imprison, conspiracy to kidnap, false imprisonment, unlawful wounding, grievous bodily harm, and unlawful possession of firearms. These are key facts established by Kenova regarding the agent Stakeknife. I'll conclude by a reflection that, in my view, Kenova has made a substantial contribution to how legacy matters should be approached. In particular, its focus on victims and families must be retained in the reformed institutions and practices going forward. It is those victims and families that all of us in Kenova have sought to serve. I will now pass back to the Chief Constable, Jon Boutcher. Jon.
Thank you, Ian. If people can't hear me, please raise your hands. I particularly want to make sure that the victims and families in the room can hear what I'm saying. So I want to begin my remarks today by acknowledging and thanking the many legacy victims and families who've shared their experiences so openly with the team across the suite of Kenova investigations. Sadly, some of those who spoke to us have since passed away, and we will never forget them. Most of us in this room can never comprehend the trauma suffered by these families over decades. I'm humbled and will be forever grateful for everything they've done to shape, support, and inspire our investigations. They deserve to know the truth of what happened to their loved ones. The Kenova reports are dedicated to them, and I hope the information we've given them has helped them in some small way deal with what happened. I'd also like to personally thank Sir Iain and everyone involved in Operation Kenova for the meticulous professional investigations that they carried out, and to thank the independent Kenova governance groups who've overseen this work. Their expertise, commitment and focus has been crucial in maintaining the victim-focused approach. I believe this approach has set the standard for how legacy investigations should be carried out through victim engagement and how they should be governed and overseen. This is a view supported by many of those who gave evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee on the government's approach to addressing the legacy of the past. It's my sincere hope that Kenova serves as the blueprint for legacy investigations and the government's new legacy framework. The key findings of Kenova were made public in the interim report published on the 8th of March last year. This was a deliberate decision to ensure that any new legacy legislation would not impact our ability to confirm what many legacy families had suspected for a long time about state involvement and non-intervention in the mistreatment, the torture and murder of people accused of being state agents during the Troubles. The final report summarises the Kenova investigations and addresses several issues which have arisen since publication of the interim report. The Kenova investigation shone a light on one of the darkest periods of Northern Ireland's history. Barely a generation has passed, but so much of what happened in this period is hard to imagine as we sit in today's modern Northern Ireland. The actions carried out by the IRA's Internal Security Unit against members of their own community are barely believable in their level of brutality. Their actions and those of the Republican leadership which initiated and sanctioned them were utterly abhorrent, wrong and inexcusable. The families of those accused of being state agents, women, children and the elderly, were also subjected to violence, and many have faced years of intimidation, isolation and humiliation at the hands of those who murdered their loved ones. The suffering of those families has undoubtedly been amplified by the failures of the state. The failure to protect individuals, the failure to properly investigate their murders, and latterly, the failure to provide survivors with the answers to which they are entitled. I've said before that the security forces operated under exceptionally dangerous and stressful conditions with extreme time pressures. They were sometimes presented with impossible decisions that had no right answer, because protecting one individual would simply expose another. Mistakes were made, and this was inevitable. However, a lack of regulation, oversight, and leadership were critical factors. These combined with the development of a situation where intelligence and investigatory functions were seen as separate, and the security forces repeatedly withheld and failed to act on information about threats to life, abductions and murders. They did this in order to protect the identity of the agents providing the information. The Kenova investigation has demonstrated that murders that could and should have been prevented were allowed to take place, and those responsible were not brought to justice. Instead, they were left free to kill again. In the aftermath of these brutal crimes, many families were never given even the most basic information about what had happened to their loved ones. There are many reasons for this, including the dangerous operating environment at the time, which made it difficult, if not impossible, for the police to meet families. However, as families will testify, and has been demonstrated repeatedly through legacy inquiries, there was a culture within the security forces of withholding information. While security forces have a duty to protect the identity of their agents, time and time again, Kenova found evidence that source protection was treated as being more important than protecting other people's lives, the criminal justice system, and the rule of law. The army agent known as Steak Knife was central to the efforts of the security forces to gather intelligence about the IRA's internal security unit. I'll repeat what I've said in the past. Steak Knife was one individual. Steak Knife was an important source of intelligence, but he was also involved in the most serious and inexcusable criminality whilst operating as an agent, including murders. Steak Knife's activity resulted in more lives being lost than were saved. Even if that had not been the case, the morality and legality of agents doing such harm as torture and murder with the knowledge and protection of the state would be unacceptable today and should have been then. Agents must act within the law. They are not immune from prosecution, and they cannot be given absolute assurances of anonymity and confidentiality regardless of what they do. Steak Knife's true identity has been the subject of public claims and legal action for years. If he'd been a police agent, I would have named him in the knowledge that this would not have put anyone at risk of harm or affected the recruitment and retention of agents in support of contemporary policing. However, because Steak Knife was an army agent, the government has the final say when it comes to his identification. It's therefore incredibly disappointing that despite repeated requests from Sir Iain, the government has refused to authorise the Kenova Final Report to identify Steak Knife. The government's position is that naming him would breach its neither confirm nor deny NCND policy in connection with the identification of state agents. I completely agree that agents need to be protected by a cloak of anonymity and enhanced secrecy. Otherwise, they will not come forward. But this cannot amount to immunity or a right to act with impunity. Society and the courts will rightfully support the NCND approach based on the very reasonable assumption that agents and the security agencies act properly and within the rule of law. However, when this is not the case, as with Steak Knife, NCND can cease to serve the public interest and become the enemy of accountability and justice. In such situations, it must be put to one side. It is ironic that those arguing most strongly for NCND and against the identification of Steak Knife, the security agencies, so abjectly failed to protect so many of their own agents from him, despite the risks they were running on behalf of those agencies. They simply allowed people to be harmed and killed to protect his identity. The NCND policy has always allowed for exceptions, whereby the agent status can be confirmed or denied if circumstances demand. The final Kenova report highlights such examples relating to Northern Ireland, and none of them had any adverse impact on the recruitment or retention of agents, the supply of secret intelligence, or national security. No statement about the identity of Steak Knife can be made without reference to Freddie Scappaticci. He is publicly alleged to have been a senior member of the IRA Internal Security Unit and to have been Steak Knife. To directly quote a solicitor for the Kenova families who spoke to the BBC in 2024, the dogs in the street know that Fred Scappaticci is the agent Steak Knife. Scappaticci remained a critical person of interest at the heart of Operation Kenova, and strong evidence was found implicating him in serious criminality. He was arrested, interviewed under caution, and files on him were submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions for Northern Ireland. In 2018, he was convicted in England for possession of extreme pornography. In March 2023, before any prosecution decisions were announced, Scappaticci died aged 77. He was never charged with or convicted of any Troubles-related offences and always denied any wrongdoing or involvement with the security forces. On the 13th of April of 2023, the Public Prosecution Service of Northern Ireland announced a no decision outcome on 10 out of 28 Operation Kenova files following the death earlier that year of the only suspect named within them. Frederick Scappaticci was that suspect. He was the person referred to in this final report as being reported for perjury offences. The perjury matter is set out in the interim report. On the 28th of July this year, the High Court in London ordered that Scappaticci's will be sealed under Section 124 of the Senior Courts Act of 1981. As I understand it, this was the first time such an order has been made in connection with the will of someone who was not a member of the royal family. The person making the application used a pseudonym and claimed their life would be at risk if public inspection of the will was allowed. I cannot comment on the evidence put before the judge, but can say that I'm not aware of any information to suggest that public inspection of Mr. Scappaticci's will would put anyone at risk. As already mentioned, the government's refusal to allow Kenova to confirm whether or not Scappaticci was Steak Knife means that this final report cannot go into public detail about the crimes it investigated. When I was in charge of Kenova, I was often asked, why can't you report on what Steak Knife did, but without naming him? Unfortunately, any attempt to do this would face government security objections. The IRA's Internal Security Unit was not large, and a lot is publicly known about the activities and the movements of Scappaticci. Any report connecting Steak Knife with particular dates, places or victims would quickly reveal whether or not he was Scappaticci. As a result, the truth is still being unnecessarily suppressed decades after the events in question, and this is having a profound and severe adverse impact on victims and families, legitimate public discussion and debate, media freedom, open justice, and public confidence in state agencies and the criminal justice system. The ongoing secrecy is also fueling further grievance, conspiracy theories, and the suffering of his victims and their families. Furthermore, it also allows the government to hide behind the shield of NCND, refrain from comment, and avoid accountability. This extends not only to the operation and resettlement of Steak Knife, but also to the fallout from the public allegations that he was Scappaticci. These allegations led to convictions being quashed, Scappaticci being resettled in England at great public expense, Scappaticci bringing applications for judicial review and an injunction on the basis he was not Steak Knife and was at risk of harm if discovered, and now the the sealing of his will. None of these matters can be subject to proper public scrutiny and understanding while the identity of Steak-Knife remains unconfirmed. I question whether this decision protects agents, or rather, does it actually protect the government and intelligence agencies from accountability for historical wrongdoing? By way of example, Scappaticci's judicial review challenging the government's refusal to deny that he was Steak-Knife, which was at the heart of the perjury allegations against him, led to a judgment which is routinely relied on in support of the NCND policy. However, the Lord Chief Justice who gave that judgment and decided to hear the case after being secretly briefed as to the true identity of Steak-Knife, and yet the government has never had to explain this. Kenova's position, which I strongly share, is that the circumstances of this case are exceptional and the identity of Steak-Knife should be officially confirmed so that the truth as to all these matters can be laid to bear and properly scrutinised. I believe the government's refusal to allow this is untenable and bordering on farce. And as someone who's worked in this space for more than 3 decades, I do not accept that a departure from NCND would impact, let alone damage national security. Indeed, the contrary would occur. Naming him would lead to government scrutiny and accountability that would ultimately strengthen national security and lead to the better protection of agents. Like the accountability we've recently seen in the Hillsborough disaster, such holding to account must eventually happen. I think it's important to make clear that the official identification of Steak-Knife would not put anyone in Northern Ireland at any risk of harm. The final report also sets out the impact of the late disclosure by MI5, 8 years after the investigation began and days after the initial Kenova report had been published, of additional relevant material relating to Steak-Knife. This was deeply frustrating. It delayed the publication of this final report and undermined the confidence of families and stakeholders in the process. Trust, which the Kenova team had patiently built up and earned over years, was undoubtedly shaken, if not lost for some. The new material revealed that MI5 had greater and earlier knowledge of Steak-Knife than had been previously disclosed. The organisation's role in running Steak-Knife was far from peripheral, as had been claimed. While the DPP for Northern Ireland is of the view that the new material would not have altered his prosecution decisions on the Kenova files, investigative opportunities, as Sir Iain has explained, were undoubtedly lost. No new murders were uncovered, but incidents were detailed which could have been put to witnesses, generated new lines of inquiry, and perhaps formed the basis for submissions to the Director of Public Prosecutions for additional offences. We will never know the full impact of this late discovery. This episode undoubtedly represents a serious organisational failure on the part of MI5. I have significant concerns that the enduring influence of MI5 on legacy matters and its approach to NCND will undermine the trust and confidence of families and others seeking the truth in the willingness and ability of the security forces to provide them with the answers that they deserve. Without this, any new legacy arrangements will not succeed. There is a further risk that the government appears to be listening most intently to those who've done the most to frustrate legacy investigations. The new legacy framework sets out that organisations holding legacy material will be responsible for classifying documents and deciding what is relevant. That is wrong. A key lesson from Kenova, as set out in its second recommendation, is that the obligation to disclose must be unqualified. I believe the decision on relevance must sit with the new Legacy Commission. Only the legacy investigator will be in a position to properly decide on the relevance of material. As the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, I'm determined that all information, including all sensitive information relevant to Troubles-related cases, will be disclosed to the new Legacy Commission. There is a very real policing cost to Legacy that goes beyond the £24 million of a bill that it brings to the PSNI each year. It's clear that the failure to satisfactorily address the legacy of the past is a significant factor undermining community support for policing. Perceptions about our role in Legacy represent an ongoing barrier to attracting increased numbers of officers from a Catholic background. Legacy must be addressed in a way that has the support and confidence of victims and every community. Today's report contains summaries of other Legacy investigations and reviews undertaken by the Kenova team, Operations Mizzenmast, Terma and Denton. I'm limited in what I can say publicly at this stage on each of these. Out of respect of the views of the Jean Smith Campbell family, I do not intend to discuss Operation Mizzenmast here. Operation Terma, the investigation of the murder of Sergeant Sean Quinn and Constables Paul Hamilton and Alan McCloy, is subject to ongoing criminal proceedings. Operation Denton, an independent review of a series of sectarian gun and bomb attacks committed by loyalists between 1972 and 1978. Those responsible included members of the security forces. They were referred to as the Glenanne Gang. The full Denton report will be published in due course, but I want to draw out of its conclusions some of the significant public matters of interest. A number of the incidents within the Glenanne Gang series involved members of the security forces who were arrested and convicted of serious terrorist offences. Loyalists were provided with intelligence by corrupt members of the security forces. There is clear evidence of collusion with the UVF by state actors. However, the review found no evidence that the RUC was involved or complicit with the activities of extremists or terrorists at a corporate or organisational level. In a number of cases, information about the involvement of prominent loyalists was not acted upon. Whilst there was clear collusion between loyalist terrorists and some members of the UDR and RUC, the review has not discovered any material which indicates that the security forces systematically collaborated with prolific offenders, or that any individual or group were organisationally protected by the security forces. Denton did not find evidence of high-level state collusion or an intent on the part of the leadership of the British Army or the UK government to collaborate with loyalist paramilitaries. In addition, no material has been discovered which evidences or implies a deliberate strategy on behalf of the security forces or the UK government to either not pursue or actively support the activities of loyalist terrorists. The 1974 Dublin and Monaghan bombings were some of the most shocking incidents during the period of the Troubles, killing 33 innocent civilians. During the course of the review work carried out by Operation Denton into these bombings, strong views were expressed alleging collusion on the part of the British state. The review team has therefore been particularly rigorous in seeking evidence of collusion relating to these attacks. This is a matter of legitimate public interest, and it's therefore important the Operation Denton findings are clear. These were: the UVF in Belfast and Mid-Ulster was responsible for the 1974 Dublin and Monaghan bombings. The UVF independently possessed the necessary materials, knowledge and expertise to mount these attacks without any support from the security forces. There was no specific intelligence which, if acted upon, could have prevented the bombings. In the aftermath of the attacks, the RUC and Army were in possession of intelligence which identified a number of those believed to have been involved in the attacks. No new information has been discovered by Operation Denton which would confirm or contradict a view that the Glenann farm played a role in the attacks. The review has not identified any evidence or intelligence which would indicate that British security forces colluded with the UVF to carry out these attacks, nor has any evidence of state collusion been identified. In concluding, and thank you for your patience, the final Kenova report outlines the challenges of conducting legacy investigations, but demonstrates that no matter how difficult they can be, it is possible to find the truth of what happened for many victims and their families. Many victims have remarked to me that Kenova has, I quote, changed the landscape of legacy, and also, and I quote, it's changed the weather regarding the disclosure of information. We still have more to do. I hope that the information provided to victims and families and the approach taken has helped these remarkable people. I also hope, alongside a new impetus to address legacy on both sides of the border, this report will encourage everyone involved to redouble their efforts to find a joint solution to this troubled past. We owe this to all of the families that have suffered during the Troubles. As Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, I promise I will continue to play my part. Thank you.